The wire looked older than the city, rust flaking like pepper over stone, a tired barrier that couldn't decide whether it was prison or shepherd's fence. The sea pushed a salt breath through the alleys and lifted the edges of canvas hospital tents, snapping them like flags. Lieutenant Ruth Lee knelt in the grit, boots braced, and pinched open a paper packet of sulfanilamide. "Tieni fermo," she said. Kitchen Italian learned between night shifts. On the other side, a young mother, Lucia Esposito, hair powdered with plaster dust, extended an arm where jagged shrapnel had kissed and festered. She didn't flinch at pain so much as at the idea that an American would share a soldier's medicine with a civilian. Morphine's small brass cigarette dangled spent from Ruth's collar, a medal of fatigue. An MP's palm hovered near his holster as the crowd leaned, a tide of bandaged hands and tired eyes. "Ma'am, we can't," he began, but Sergeant Joe Ramirez had already scratched chalk lanes on cobbles, carving the press into order. "Two abreast. Keep it moving," he said, voice like a metronome. Ruth dusted the wound, folded a sterile dressing, and slid it between the barbs. The white powder bloomed on brown skin. The mother breathed as if some 100-pound fear had lifted an inch. Ruth showed the husband how to tie the knot, pointed to a boiling pot drawn on a scrap of ration box. Boil water, boil rags, repeat. A Red Cross truck rattled past with a smell of oil and gauze. Behind Ruth's shoulder, a medic's pouch hung open, tourniquet coiled like a sleeping snake, sulfadiazine tablets in a waxed envelope, triangular bandages stacked like folded flags. In a nearby tent, plasma bottles swayed from a rope line, pale lanterns tethered to the wounded. None of it felt like enough. All of it felt like defiance. Lucia blinked and nodded, the word grazie landing as if it had been waiting years for a runway. Rumour moves faster than trucks. By the time Ruth repinned the syringe to her collar, the line had doubled, then doubled again. "We'll run dry," a corporal muttered, counting dressings, but Joe's pencil was already tallying requisitions. Class 8, emergency issue, 24 hours cover for civilian triage. The MP lowered his hand and took up a corner of rope to stretch a path, because order was mercy too. Somewhere down the street, a church bell rang the hour and a child laughed, a small clear note in the diesel air. The fence, which had started the hour as a hard edge, became a hinge. As Ruth wiped sulphur from her fingers with a square of sterile gauze, she realized the thing they had opened wasn't a packet. It was the city. At first light, the Peninsula Base section yard smelled of wet rope and creosote. The harbour's breath snagged in coils stacked like sleeping pythons. A forklift coughed awake, backfired, then settled into a workman's growl. Stencils marched in olive lines along crate faces. Surgical dressings, plasma, human, handle cold, morphine tartrate, Siretis, penicillin, en route. Sergeant Joe Ramirez traced a thumbnail over a lot number the way a gunsmith checks a serial, habit, reverence, and the quiet fear of error. A depot is a nervous system, requisition in, supply out, no delay between impulse and limb. Marco Belandi, boots still dusty from the intake pen, watched with the attentive shame of a captured quartermaster. The armband, Italian service unit, felt like a question. He had once guarded a cabinet with 3 vials of quinine and a drawer of bandages laundered to lace. Here, a corporal broke open a crate of sterile compresses and sighed at the abundance the way a baker sighs at fresh flour. Joe slid a clipboard toward him. "You read English?" Marco nodded. "Then you can run with me," Joe said, pointing, receiving dock, inspection, shock chill for plasma, dry stores, outbound staging. Cadence is everything. He issued the day's first emergency ticket, civilian triage support to the field hospital on Via Marina, and the paper felt heavier than its weight, as if policy had leaned forward in its chair. A medical captain argued doctrine. Joe pointed to the ledger lines where numbers stood like ranks. "Sir, we hold 7 days buffer. We can spare 1 day to stop an outbreak. We'll pay for twice if it spreads." The captain, who had seen cholera maps, signed. They moved like an orchestra. Pallets lifted and swung, a reefer truck's breath fogged in the cool bay. Marco learned the codes: lot, batch, expiry, absorbed the ethic. You don't issue on hope, you issue on schedule. He held a morphine carton and did a silent conversion. This single morning outflow matched a month of his former regiment's best days, a fact that felt like thunder with no sound. Warehouses are cathedrals where the hymns are numbers. Lucia appeared at the fence with 3 women and a folded list in careful script: soap, gauze, infant dressings. Joe broke the rule that had already begun to break itself and allocated a small civilian packet under supervision. Ruth's handwriting appeared on a chit, a septic technique briefing at 1600, nurses welcome. The depot was teaching the city to breathe. As the sun slid higher, the forklift operator leaned out and asked, "Sergeant, what's the priority?" Joe didn't look up from the ledger. "Civilians don't get our last crate," he said, "but they get the one before last." It sounded like a promise because it was. Damp crept into everything. Cot canvas felt tacky, uniforms held the alley's breath. On a plywood board balanced over 2 sawhorses, a medical officer pinned a city map and lit it with a desk lamp scavenged from a ruined office. Red-headed pins clustered like a rash along markets and stairwells, a topography of fever. "Typhus," he said, and the word was heavier than a bullet because it travelled where bullets could not. Lucia listened from the doorway, shawl drawn close, her hand unconsciously searching her child's scalp. Ruth thought of louse eggs hidden in seams and armpits, and the soft places behind ears. Trucks arrived with compressors that would have looked at home in a factory. The typhus commission men handled them like instrument cases, humming as they checked gaskets and belts. Joe signed for nozzles, hoses, spare valves. Marco stenciled DDT on olive tins with a care that bordered on prayer. They staged in a courtyard, chalked lanes, and set up chairs that would become a procession. Ruth gave a demonstration. Hair parted, powder applied, sleeves rolled, she narrated in patient Italian, translating antisepsis into ritual. "You'll smell it," she warned, "and it will settle on the lintels." That is the point. The first hiss sounded like steam from a kettle, then deepened to a machine note that made lingerers straighten. Dust rose and hung in slanted light. Children giggled until the grit touched their tongues, then smacked their lips in surprise. Lucia stood at the head of the line with a ledger of names and the implacable authority of someone who has waited enough for help and intends not to wait again. Marco's ISU men kept the hoses fed, swapping canisters with drill precision, gloves turned white at the fingertips. By noon, the chalkboard at the clinic door carried a number so large it seemed miswritten. A single compressor line, run hard, could treat roughly 1,000 people before dusk. By week's end, multiple lines would have pushed through entire neighbourhoods, statistics that to Lucia sounded impossible until she watched them happen. The map's pins didn't pull themselves, but they paused, and that felt like victory measured in negative space. Joe recalculated buffer stock for nozzles and gaskets. Ruth taught delousing as if she were teaching hand to hand, because in truth she was. Dark came with sea fog, and the courtyard smelled of soap, dust, and the faint sweetness of relief. A British major visiting from civil affairs watched the line dwindle and said almost to himself, "If we can keep this tempo, the disease will run out of places to hide." Ruth wiped DDT from a child's eyelashes with a gauze square and nodded. The second front had opened without a shot, and already the city was moving its civilians like battalions. A reefer truck backed to the dock, its engine idling with a cold patience. Joe felt the temperature on his forearms when the doors swung wide, a small winter rolling into summer, and counted vials like a banker reading a nation's credit. Penicillin had been rumour and rarity. Now it arrived on a schedule that looked like faith-made paper. He checked the log. Receipt time, ambient chill box transfer, spoilage allowance. In the field tent, Ruth unfolded a dosage chart with the same care she used for a flag and breathed out, long, like someone lowering a weight. The first case would have been military always, but war doesn't respect neat lines. A factory hand with a laceration, fever rising, lay 2 cots from a corporal with a burn. Ruth followed the book. Culture, dose, interval. She explained to Lucia, who had brought the man in, how the drug worked without magic. A timetable the body could believe in. "We'll know by morning," she said, and said a quiet prayer to every chemist, nurse and machinist between this tent and a Midwestern plant that had turned vats into lifeboats. Marco carried ampules in a padded tray, the clink careful as church. He remembered arguing over aspirin rations, weighing men against tablets with a ledger that had no mercy. Here, Joe penciled a week's supply curve and backed it with buffer stock, trucks, rail schedules, convoy notes. The penicillin went not to the most connected or the most feared, but to the most in need by a priority written before today's faces. Policy had a conscience that didn't ask permission. By evening, the factory hand's fever bent a degree and then another, a small descent that felt like a ridge crested. Ruth took his pulse, wrote a number, and realized she was smiling with her eyes. Lucia brought a cup of watered wine and whispered that the neighborhood had noticed. Americans have medicine that turns. The phrase would travel faster than any bulletin. Joe rechecked the reefer. Thermometers held steady. He issued guidance to the night shift. Shake, don't stir. Log every dose. Waste is a sin you confess on paper. In the quiet hours, a medic asked if the supply would hold. Joe tapped the schedule. "Weekly inbound," he said. "We'll adjust. We're not rich. We're reliable." It sounded like a sermon begun and left hanging for the next day's amen. Marco folded the padded tray into its locker and, for the first time since the wire, looked not at what was missing, but at what would arrive. Outside, the harbour clicked and sighed. Inside, a fever broke. Morning found paperwork where Mercy had walked first. A colonel in a tent office, sleeves rolled and tie loose, signed a memorandum that gave the day a backbone. Central Civilian Medical Depot, Naples. The words made official what the hands had already done. Joe received the signal on a field phone that still smelled faintly of ship varnish. "You're authorized," the voice said. He didn't cheer. He recalibrated. New ledger columns appeared in pencil. Civilian issue, inspection required, returnable containers. The lines looked like rail tracks laid toward a better station. Ruth welcomed a dozen Italian nurses to a canvas classroom. She taught asepsis with the battlefield's brevity. Boil, scrub, dry, don't touch that surface. If you touch it, boil again. She emptied a medic's pouch onto a cot, tourniquet, compresses, triangular bandages, safety pins, a blood-stained field dressing for demonstration, and translated doctrine into habit. "You'll save more with soap than with miracles," she said, and Lucia translated, the cadence of command softened into neighbourly instruction. They practised knots until the bandages lay snug and clean as officer creases. Marco wrote bilingual SOPs with soldier's neatness, adding the cautions an American might assume, but an Italian clerk would need spelled out. He diagrammed a truck route that avoided a known bottleneck and circled a fountain because people gather there after market. Joe fought for buffer stock in a briefing, arguing that a convoy delayed by weather would cost more in outbreaks than the warehouse space would cost in dust. The colonel listened with the expression of a man who had learned to fear arithmetic late and now feared it properly. Outside the fence, the queue had changed. People no longer pressed the wire. They approached a checkpoint where names were checked, passes stamped, and carts guided to a civilian clinic run under Allied supervision. A boy with a broken arm held still while an Italian nurse set the splint Ruth had taught her to set. A mother exchanged old linens for clean bandages with the solemn pride of a barter done fair. The depot issued to clinics, not to pockets. Mercy had a manifest. compassion came on time. At dusk, Joe stood at the warehouse threshold and watched a truck bearing the new stencil, "Civilian Priority," disappear into an alley that glowed like a coal seam. He thought of the first packet of sulphur sliding through wire and felt the distance they had travelled measured not in miles but in procedure. Behind him, forklifts scooped and settled pallets with a tired grace. Ahead, Lucia's voice floated from a courtyard as she rehearsed for delousing day. The door had opened. Now it would stay open because the hinges were numbered and greased. The captured memo smelled faintly of damp leather and carbon ribbon, the scent of a staff officer's worry. Marco translated aloud at the depot desk while Joe traced a finger down his own ledger, the two documents like mismatched mirrors. "Quinine allotment reduced," Marco read, voice dry. "Bandage reuse authorized to third cycle. Evacuation delayed pending fuel." He hesitated on the next line. "Priority to officer's ward." Lucia sat nearby, knitting with tension that pulled the yarn thin, and asked, because someone had to, "How do they choose who waits?" Marco had no word gentle enough in either language. Ruth arrived with a cup of coffee that tasted of boiled tin and listened with the stillness of a surgeon waiting for a pulse. She thought of POW inspections, stateside she'd heard described in briefings, dental chairs in barracks, vaccination schedules pinned to bulletin boards, and felt the oddness of a war in which prisoners' routines could be better than civilians' days. Not charity, compliance, Geneva's spine, but the effect was the same, an ethic that taught even enemies to expect cleanliness and a doctor's touch. She imagined a German orderly reading this memo, knuckles pale, and set the cup down. Joe flipped to a page that mapped outbound civilian issue, dressings, soap, nozzles, spare gaskets, weekly cadence. He added the day's penicillin doses to the total and the curve of return to duty for troops and clinic recoveries for civilians. Numbers spoke when mouths failed. The impossible statistic for any man raised on rationing was this: a single week at the Naples depot now issued more sterile gauze than Marco's former regiment had used in its last year of fighting. Marco said it first, not as boast, but as astonishment, and the room fell quiet around the truth. They did not gloat. War had taught them to mistrust easy triumph, but the comparison landed like a strategic revelation: abundance, disciplined, altered behaviour. Lucia folded her knitting and said softly that the queue at the civilian clinic had grown orderly because people believed the door would open tomorrow and the day after. Scarcity made mobs, schedules made citizens. Ruth noted on her board that infections were down in the district with the highest delousing throughput. Joe circled a date: convoy due, buffer intact. Marco underlined a sentence in the enemy memo about laundering bandages and felt heat rise to his cheeks. Outside, church bells sounded the hour in a city that had learned to measure time by compressor cycles and reefer thermometers. Joe closed his ledger. Marco folded the memo with care and slid it beneath the blotter as if interring an old faith. "We will answer this without speaking," Ruth said, lifting her kit. "With procedures." Lucia nodded and stood, shawl straight. The next truck backed to the dock and beeped, a homely sound that, here, meant victory. Night came crimson over the Bay of Naples. Mount Vesuvius, quiet for generations, awoke like an artillery piece the earth had hidden in plain sight. Ash hissed against tent canvas with the sly sound of sleet. Cinders rattled across the depot roof until the metal sang. Sergeant Joe Ramirez felt the tremor through his boots as he checked convoy manifests. He knew the numbers by heart. 70-plus B-25 Mitchell bombers of the 340th Bomb Group parked at Pompey Airfield, each worth months of enemy production, each suddenly sitting beneath a sky that glowed like a foundry. The mountain did what Luftwaffe sorties had failed to do, destroyed entire squadrons in a single night. Yet the American system, built for shocks, flexed instead of broke. Ruth Lee dampened cloths and tied them over children's noses inside the hospital tent. The air tasted of sulphur and wet pumice, a bitterness that burned the throat. Outside, Lucia Esposito guided families into cellars already white with DDT dust from the winter's delousing campaign, the chemical grit mixing now with volcanic ash. "Stay low," she urged, voice steady, though her own eyes watered. Marco Belandi and his Italian service unit detail worked by flashlight, dragging tarpaulins across stacks of medical crates, sealing gaskets with improvised rope so that ash would not turn gauze to mud. Joe rerouted trucks toward covered docks and issued orders in the clipped cadence of supply doctrine. Protect Class 8 stores first, then rations, then munitions. Forklifts moved like armoured insects under a storm that glowed red. He recorded each diversion on a clipboard already speckled with grey dust, knowing the ledger would tell a story the volcano could not erase. By morning, the airfield lay in ruin, over 70 aircraft destroyed or crippled, yet the depot's medical throughput had dipped less than 10%. Replacement orders had already moved through stateside factories whose monthly output outstripped the entire Italian aircraft industry for a year. The mountain's fury, to the astonishment of local civilians, became just another column in an American spreadsheet. As dawn broke copper across a city glazed in ash, Joe stood amid trucks layered in two colours of dust, white from DDT, grey from Vesuvius, and thought of the German medical memo he had read days earlier, with its talk of reused bandages and fuel delays. Nature had struck harder than enemy bombers, and still the American supply cadence held. Marco brushed a hand across a crate marked penicillin and found it clean beneath the film of ash. "Even the mountain," he said quietly, "cannot starve this army." Joe nodded, pencil poised. The day's first convoy was already forming, engines coughing like men waking to work. Compressors drummed like factory looms in the courtyards of Naples, the sound a steady heartbeat against the distant rumble of an uneasy volcano. The Typhus Commission had returned with reinforcements, more sprayers, more olive-drab tins of DDT, and a doctrine as crisp as any field order: infect the louse, not the man. Lucia Esposito, hair tied in a scarf the colour of midnight, called names from a ledger and shepherded neighbours into lines as orderly as any military parade. Children squirmed until the first hiss of white dust settled their giggles into awe. Ruth Lee demonstrated once more the quick parting of hair and the slow, even sweep of the nozzle. The chemical fog-coated lintels and stair rails clung to laundry strung across alleys like flags of surrender. She explained in measured Italian how the powder killed the carriers before the fever could spread. Behind her, Marco Belandi's service unit men worked with soldierly precision, feeding hoses, swapping canisters, gloves turned ghost white at the fingertips. Joe Ramirez kept the chalkboard of statistics: people processed per hour, nozzle change intervals, gallons expended. His figures rose like a graph of quiet victories. By week's end, a single compressor line was treating close to 1,000 civilians a day. With multiple lines running, the number would dwarf what most European cities could have managed even in peacetime. To veterans of ration cards and black market aspirin, the pace bordered on the miraculous. Marco, once responsible for hoarding quinine as if it were gold, stared at the daily totals, figures that made his former regiment's entire medical budget look like a rounding error. Here was an impossible statistic. In one 7-day stretch, Allied sprayers dusted more civilians than the entire German medical service in Italy could have vaccinated in a year. The transformation was not merely numerical. Order replaced desperation. Rumours of scarcity gave way to the expectation of schedule. People began to arrive on time because they believed the Americans would too. Lucia saw it in the way mothers straightened children's collars before stepping into the plume, as if presenting them for inspection in a new civic ritual. Even the ash from Vesuvius could not hide the white sheen left behind. The city looked as though a late snow had fallen, a winter of mercy in Mediterranean spring. When the last compressor sputtered to silence at dusk, a hush settled over the courtyard, broken only by the ticking of cooling engines. Joe chalked the final figure and stepped back, the board crowded with numbers that spoke louder than any speech. Ruth wiped a trace of DDT from a child's cheek and whispered, "This is how we win without firing a shot." The child blinked, uncomprehending, but the city understood. By midsummer, the Naples depot no longer felt improvised. It moved like an orchestra tuned to a metronome of convoys and manifests. Forklifts squealed across concrete in practiced counterpoint, while reefer trucks hissed their cold breath. Sergeant Joe Ramirez conducted with pencil and clipboard, every tick a cue for motion. Crates stamped Central Civilian Medical Depot stood 4 high, their olive sides scarred from travel, yet sealed tight as vaults. Above the din, gulls wheeled like restless overseers. Marco Belandi trained new Italian service unit recruits, his voice carrying the authority of a man who once counted quinine by the spoonful and now managed stocks measured in tons. He drilled them in pallet codes and buffer calculations. Never let Class 8 inventory fall below 7 days of supply, log every issue, rotate cold chain plasma within 24 hours. His former comrades in the disintegrating Axis would have found the abundance unbelievable. 1 week's civilian issue of sterile gauze now surpassed what an entire German field army might consume in a year. It was an arithmetic that humbled and, to Marco, liberated. Ruth Lee audited the civilian clinics that had sprung from this supply river. She found Italian nurses, some trained in her own makeshift classes, setting splints, scrubbing instruments, reciting antisepsis protocols like liturgy. The sound of boiling kettles and the sharp scent of carbolic marked a new kind of front line. She corrected a slip of technique here, praised a well-tied bandage there, and knew that the system could now outlast her presence. Lucia Esposito stood in her neighborhood clinic, a ledger in her hands, noting births, fevers broken, wounds healed. The once timid mother now commanded the respect of dock workers and school teachers alike. People queued calmly because they trusted the next shipment would arrive. Schedules had replaced rumors. Predictability had become a civic virtue. Across the Atlantic, letters from Italian POWs in American camps spoke of dental care and regular vaccinations, echoes of the same ethic. Joe read one aloud to his crew. "We are treated as men, not enemies." He smiled at the quiet symmetry. Whether in a Naples alley or a Kansas stockade, the American answer to tyranny was order and mercy, backed by production capacity no dictator could match. When the evening whistle blew, the depot settled into a hum like a ship at anchor. Joe closed his ledger on a week in which medical throughput had exceeded the entire pre-war output of Italy's largest pharmaceutical works. He looked across rows of stacked crates and thought, not for the first time, that abundance itself had become a weapon, and that they were winning with it. The first cool winds of autumn swept through Naples, carrying the smell of damp stone and diesel. Inside a quiet office carved from a warehouse corner, Sergeant Joe Ramirez spread his ledgers across a scarred table. The figures filled page after page, tons of gauze issued, thousands deloused, hundreds of penicillin courses completed. To an untrained eye, they were dry abstractions. To Joe, they were divisions kept in the fight, children spared a fever's scythe. He sharpened a pencil and began to translate numbers into consequence. Ruth Lee tallied infection rates and return to duty curves for Allied troops. Cases of wound sepsis cut in half since penicillin arrived, hospital stays shortened by days. She paired those statistics with clinic records from the civilian program, where typhus incidents had fallen so sharply that British civil affairs officers called it one of the greatest medical successes of the Second World War. Each drop in the curve meant a platoon that stayed whole or a neighbourhood spared the panic of quarantine. Lucia Esposito, now keeper of her clinic's own books, compared attendance charts and saw how predictability had bred trust. Families who once hoarded scraps of soap now came on schedule, confident that supplies would not vanish overnight. She understood without needing the vocabulary of doctrine that order itself was a kind of freedom. Marco Belandi reviewed captured German reports. Quinine rationed to officers, bandages washed to rags, hospital trains delayed for lack of fuel. He laid those thin records beside Joe's thick ledgers and felt the weight of contrast. 1 week of American civilian medical issue now eclipsed the entire Axis monthly supply for occupied Italy, a statistic that seemed impossible even as he touched the paper. The numbers told a story of industrial democracy at war, Midwestern factories turning cornfields into antibiotic vats, chemical plants producing in a single hour more DDT than the enemy could refine in a month, shipyards feeding the Mediterranean lifeline with the punctuality of commuter trains. Behind every digit stood machinists, farmers, chemists, citizen soldiers in coveralls who would never see Naples but whose work echoed in every healed wound. Joe set down his pencil and listened to the depot's night sounds. The slow drip of condensation from a reefer unit, the distant clank of a returning convoy. He thought of the mountain's eruption, of the first sulfur packet passed through wire, and of the quiet revolution these ledgers recorded. Numbers without pulse were mere accounting. Numbers with pulse were victory. Snow dusted the high passes north of Naples, while rain slicked the city's cobblestones. In a briefing room warmed by a smoky stove, a US colonel pinned a phrase to the wall: "Health as combat power." The words captured what months of improvisation had proven. Naples was no longer an emergency. It was a model. Joe Ramirez stood beside his ledgers as officers mapped the program's replication northward: Rome, Florence, the Po Valley. Red arrows showed not just troop movements but lines of medical supply, civilian clinics marked with the same priority symbols as ammunition dumps. Ruth Lee listened as planners spoke of scaling lessons learned, delousing campaigns timed to follow the advance, penicillin stockpiles pre-positioned for both soldiers and civilians, Italian service units integrated into logistics. She recognized in their jargon the human faces of Lucia's neighborhood and the children whose fevers had broken under her care. What had begun as an act of mercy through a fence now shaped Allied doctrine. Marco Belandi provided testimony on the performance of ISUS, former prisoners now running warehouses with precision that rivaled any US quartermaster. He offered figures: daily throughput rates, error margins under 2%, buffer stock maintained even during the Vesuvius eruption. Officers nodded. The numbers were not merely impressive, they were proof that humane treatment converted enemies into partners. Captured enemy memos lay on the table for contrast. German hospitals rationing quinine, Italian fascist remnants hoarding sulfur. The comparison no longer needed rhetoric, the statistics spoke. One American factory in Peoria, the colonel noted, produced in a single day more penicillin than the entire Axis had managed in the war to date. The room absorbed the figure in a silence that felt like awe. Lucia sat quietly at the back, invited as a civilian witness. She thought of the first day at the wire, of the chalk lanes, of the mountain that had burned without breaking them. Hearing officers describe her city as a template for liberation, she realized that the generosity she had once doubted had become policy, and that policy would march with the armies until the war's end. Outside, church bells marked the hour. The colonel tapped the map and said, "We will carry Naples with us." Joe closed his ledger, aware that the work of counting had become the work of strategy. What had begun as a single act of unlooked-for mercy was now written into the playbook of victory. The war's tide rolled north, leaving Naples less a battlefield than a blueprint. Spring sunlight caught the rusting wire where Ruth Lee had first passed a packet of sulfur through to a stranger. Grass threaded the barbs, children played tag around posts that had once defined fear. Ruth packed her kit for another assignment, folding triangular bandages with the same care she had shown on that first day. She touched the fence lightly, a benediction and a farewell. Joe Ramirez prepared the final turnover of the Central Civilian Medical Depot. His last ledger showed statistics that still startled him. Millions of civilian delousings, thousands of penicillin courses, tons of sterile gauze issued. He compared those figures to captured enemy records, months of scarcity, hospitals rationing basics, and understood that the numbers were more than arithmetic. They were the architecture of a new order. Factories back home had produced in 1 hour what fascist Europe could not match in a month. Abundance, disciplined and democratic, had proved a weapon sharper than steel. Lucia Esposito now ran her neighborhood clinic without Allied supervision. Mothers brought infants for vaccinations as regularly as they once brought bread to the baker. The predictability of care had become the rhythm of civic life. She remembered the ash of Vesuvius and the white fog of DDT, the nights of rumour and the mornings of order, and knew that the Americans had left more than supplies. They had left a template for trust. Marco Belandi, once a prisoner, now wore the insignia of an Italian service unit veteran. He wrote to his brother in the north, "They win because they heal. They built an army that can outproduce, out-organize and out-care any empire. We have seen it," he sealed the letter with the quiet pride of a man who had measured 2 systems and chosen the stronger. When the last convoy rolled out, the depot yard echoed only with the cry of gulls. The fence remained, a relic of barbed wire and rust, but its meaning had inverted. What once marked division now marked the hinge where a democracy had revealed its greatest strength, not merely to fight, but to heal faster than any enemy could harm. The breeze off the bay carried the smell of salt and distant factories, a reminder that the arsenal of democracy was built not only of bombs and bullets, but of gauze, penicillin, and the unshakable belief that mercy itself can be a strategy.